First thing I wanted to get into, simply titled it, BIPOC, How You Refer to Me. There have been a lot of people who have asked about, what are the right terms to use? What do I say to someone? I have one friend who says they're Black. I have another friend who says African American. I have another friend who says person of color. I have another friend who says don't say anything. Yeah. And so it's a question that comes up again and again and again. The answer at the end of the day is that it's going to be different for every person. It's going to be different for every individual. You have to accept that. There's no uniform answer. And that is for many and plenty a reason. One reason, plenty of people will argue about the merit and the appropriateness of saying African American. Others will offer about the appropriateness of saying Black. Whether you're saying African American, whether you're saying Black, there will always be someone that does not agree with that as the term that defines them. And it's because they've all been changed, and there have been plenty in between. I mean, we have to remember that for a very, very long time, realistically, in terms of all of our history, only up until fairly recently, we were saying Negro. And by we, I think it's at least fair to say that most of us, if not all of us, probably were not using that word, but probably we're still hearing that word at times, certainly exposed to media still using those words. We're still exposed to media that still uses those words. And there's a whole merit on whether we should still have that media in existence or not. When it comes to that idea, and that's getting into a tangent, so I won't get too much there, I'm a firm believer in the idea of those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And so I think the last thing we need to be doing is editing our history. We need to remember what's gone on so we can make sure we know how to do better and that we continue to do better. Only 2 years ago, was it? No, we're in 2020 now. So this would have been 3 years ago. I was at a rehearsal for a music group that happened to be part of a religious institution. And as rehearsal was wrapping up, their conversation kind of got really off, just got really inappropriate from the director, nonchalantly asking someone in the choir about their cultural background. And I think the way they said it was, are you Chinese? Oh no, are you Oriental? Is what was said. Are you Oriental? This was in 2017 in a church. And the person, my friend, replied, I'm actually Korean and Irish, but we don't say Oriental anymore. And the director asked, who doesn't say Oriental anymore? And the choir, almost in unison, replied, no one says it anymore. It's wrong and it's inappropriate. And the choir director was very surprised by this. And things were very uncomfortable. Everyone's trying to just literally walk out the door. But as we're walking out the door, he also very nonchalantly said, and when did it no longer become okay to say Negro when referring to a Black? And I believe he was asking out of true, sincere curiosity, out of earnest curiosity. But I, as well as the entire choir, I was the only Black person in the choir at the time, but I and the entire choir were just frozen over and kind of sickened in the moment, and turned around and basically responded by shouting the person's name. I don't want to say the person's name, so this is not the person's name, but it was an example reaction of like, no, Paul, like one of those moments that everyone was just like, are you kidding me? And that was just 3 years ago. So I only mention that to really reiterate that it's still a learning process for a lot of people in terms of what are the right terms. The best thing to do, you got two options in my opinion. One is you can ask. But with asking, I would suggest that you first check and feel that you trust the person enough that you would be willing to throw out an uncomfortable question at them. And you could even preface it that way. May I ask you an uncomfortable question because I don't know any better? I think that might be a fair, honest way to present it. And you'll either get a yes or no. And if you get a yes, that's your opportunity to ask this question in a truly vulnerable place where you start by letting them know, I don't know any better on this and I want to learn. When we ask questions, when we hear questions, and we know there's an educational intention and context, we are far more open to those questions and to trying to find a true answer to those questions. Even if you're a teacher and a little kid asking a really inappropriate question, you don't react by just being like, shut up. If you do, you should not be a teacher. You react by saying, that's inappropriate. That's not something we can talk about right now. You give a respectful and fair answer because you know the child is coming from an intention of trying to learn and not trying to, be critical, not trying to be crass, not trying to be negative. There are plenty of ways it can sound negative, and the best way to get that negativity out is through honesty, transparency, and humility. Most people can understand when you are asking questions with true humility. For myself personally, I tend to use Black. I tend to say Black. I also go by person of color. I don't go by African American because personally I feel that it's disrespectful because I don't know my true African lineage and roots. If I had that knowledge, if I was in tune with that part of my history and I celebrated that part of my culture, then I would probably go by African American. But I don't, and so I know for me, it is not a term that I would use to describe myself. I would say Black. A lot of Black people have come to a point where we have reclaimed the word Black. There are a lot of ways where Black, a lot of societies, a lot of culture still today, where Black is simply used to mean not as light as others, or often to be a part of a racial classification in different cultures. That is a part of our systemic issue in our culture as well. But Black is a term that a lot of people of color have come to identify and celebrate. And so I think you will find more people using the word Black as opposed to African American. There was an in-between at one point, this was a little bit post-civil rights movement, where Black American was used. Kind of a hybrid, as they were phasing out Negro, Black American, or African American were both very common. And so the terminology has changed a lot. I kind of am just going to dovetail this into another thing with terminology because this will all loop around. But a word that's come up again lately, it's been highlighted lately, I would say, in terms of terminology, is thug. Thug has a racial history in our country in its usage. Thug has a negative connotation from the get-go. It originally, I want to say it's Middle Eastern or Asian that it originally comes from, and it actually comes back to meaning ruffian. And thugs were originally seen as scoundrels, as people who were causing problems within communities. And so even the initial history of the word thug is not, it's not pleasant. But within American society, it has gained more, let's say, interpretation to often mean African American communities, Black communities, people of color, denoting this as troublemakers, as ruffians, as scoundrels. Essentially, its true original meaning, but more harshly applied to Black people in our country. Now, I will also further that by saying thug is another term that has been somewhat reclaimed by the Black community, especially into the 80s and through the 90s, and still today, but you really saw this come about in late 80s into 90s, the rise of a new reclaiming of the word thug, of rappers taking on this persona of thug being more to represent a counter culture, an anti-establishment culture within the Black communities to earn or not to earn, but to empower ourselves with how you see us, and still stand up and say we are great even if you put these titles on us. If you look to rappers like Mystical, Ja Rule, and 50 Cent, even up through Jay-Z and so many more today. I mean, now we have just a whole plethora of wonderful things happening in terms of artists and their images and their identities, and it's fantastic, because it is what I think America should be ultimately, where things can be so blended that it's highlighted for you are part this, you are part that, you are part that, and it's all wholly celebrated, and not just like, well, we only want this and that of you. Lil Nas X is a great example of just celebrating every part of who you are, a Black man, a gay man, a rapper, country culture, and bringing, like, I'm digressing and getting off on tangents and dreams. But my point being back with the idea of thug, another term that means different things to different people. It means different things to different cultures. It's where, again, it came back out in media in the past few weeks, because we started hearing thugs being used to refer to a combination of some people calling thugs rioters and looters, others calling thugs with that umbrella, but also trying to steer that more towards predominantly Black people and people of color. And it's been a big argument back and forth. It's why when the police, was the president of the New York State, Police Benevolent Board Association, whatever the guy's name is, but he made his statement the other day about how, we're sick and tired of being treated like thugs and we want to be treated with respect. To a lot of the Black community, that felt like an absolute, we're just trying to jab it right back in your face. And really, it was perfectly indicative of the problem we have been trying to talk about with systemic racism, especially in the police. That you use thugs and you celebrate the term thug to be a big put down, and we believe, I believe, others believe, that there is a true intention for that to be aimed towards Black people and communities of color. And so there's really going to be this never-ending, not never-ending, but going on for a long time, it will feel never-ending at times, constantly tripping up on the right language. Just like it's going to be constantly tripping up on the right way to phrase things. That's a part of our human experience. As I've said before, I said this last week, that is a drop in the bucket, or a whiff in the air, if you will, of the Black experience, of trying to constantly figure out the right language, trying to constantly figure out the right way to phrase things, constantly trying to figure out, is this someone that I can say what if I just need to hear what they have to say, or do I have to say yes? Because those two things might be interpreted differently because of who I am and how I look. It's a constant struggle. It's a constant struggle with names in our culture, even, and choosing names. It's why a lot of Black people, and I can say people of color, modify their names. They do it one way or the other. Typically, they either do it one way where they're trying to find something that's going to feel more, we would describe vanilla, which speaks of itself, and using that as a term that we do use as a way of something more plain, something more acceptable, something that's not going to make someone bat an eye. It's just like, oh, well, who's that? I can't tell you how many times I've walked into interviews and someone says, William, and I stand up, and the reaction is, oh, well, come along. There's always that, that first oh that happens, and I have to do my best to not react to it so that it just seems like it flows right off the bat. Or just be like, yes, that's me. Make sure that I greet it with something even more, all is well and not a problem, to kind of just smooth out that surface. That it's a drop in the bucket when it's trying to figure out the right words, the right phrasing, the right terms to use. There was a thing going on, a feed I was on Facebook the other day with a couple other teachers asking about, what do you do? How do you address it when you want to know about someone's culture? And how do you ask them that? And what I came down to for me was the core of what you want to know is, tell me about yourself. So think about that phrase, tell me about yourself. Now add to it, why? Why are you asking the person to tell about themselves? If that why sounds appropriate and sounds, reasonable to you, use that exact language in your full statement. Tell me about yourself. We have an event coming up where we're celebrating diversity in our workplace, and I would just like to know if there's anything about your personal diversity you would care to celebrate. That's a very clear message of tell me about yourself and this is why. If it's tell me about yourself, we have to fulfill a certain quota of diversity. Is that really the question you should be asking? Is this person here only because of that identity? And if they're not here because of their identity, then I would not present a way where their identity needs to be established in that sense. If they come to you asking, I'd like to share this information, that's a time to acknowledge and to celebrate it. But it really comes down to the why. It's all in the context, because there are plenty of times when we want to say something or ask something and we mean it in a truly harmless way. We just need to be very clear about that. Last week I told a story about a friend that made a post, and the wording in the post did not have any of the clear intentions for the post. And after a conversation with that friend, there was a new post that clearly stated the intentions word for word, and the post was entirely different from the first one that was put out there. And it had an entirely different reception because it was clear for its intention that second time around. And even with that, it was the second time around. Tripped up, mistakes, it's going to happen. If we lead with our humility and we lead with this transparency, that's part of the way in building these conversations.